We are doing 90 miles per hour. 90! Out of control. Won't be able to stop till we hit Colton.
Runaway trains are one of the scariest scenarios to happen on any railroad. Several hundred tons rolling uncontrolled into a city or town is scary enough, but having a train run away into a very large, busy rail yard, that makes an already bad situation even worse, which would unfortunately be the case in Pig's Eye Yard in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul Yard, or known by its nickname Pig's Eye Yard, named after a one-eyed businessman, Pierre Pig's Eye Patron, was originally built by the Milwaukee Road in the 1880s. It would be later upgraded into a hump yard in the 1950s to make switching easier, and was later taken over by the Soo Line, who would eventually become absorbed into the Canadian Pacific. The yard sits at the start of the Meriden Park subdivision with a connection to the River subdivision, or down the Meriden sub toward Minneapolis. On the night of February 14th, 1996, Valentine's Day, the yard was still for the most part. 11 crew members, including conductor Richard Vitek of Canadian Pacific, were having lunch in the yard office. Outside, 2 trains sat idle. One consisted of just 2 locomotives, Soo Line GP9-2408 and Soo GP15C 4102. A few tracks over was a CP manifest consisting of 2 locomotives and 31 cars, those being CP SD40-2 5725 and an EMD leaser being EMDX SD40 6503. A former Louis and Nashville number 1255 that had also served the Seaboard, CSX, and VMVX. This was known as the top end job, which was going to ask for headroom to build their consist. The yardmaster agreed and gave them the switch toward the main with permission to reverse in and out of the yard when needed. That switch was about to play a critical role in a near Valentine massacre. Meanwhile, up a steep grade traveling eastward was BNSF BN01 144-14 or 8572 East. It was headed toward Pig's Eye Yard on its way to Galesburg, Illinois, consisting of 2 LMX B39-8s, originally under a long-term lease with a predecessor of BNSF, the Burlington Northern, those being 8572 and 8589. Pulling 89 cars full of grain, lumber, and other non-hazardous materials. About 5 miles from Pig's Eye Yard, the train was told to stop and wait for a train ahead to complete its switching duties. This was the top end job. The engineer obliged and stopped the train. The brakes were working fine, or seemed to be at least. Not long after the engineer of the BNSF train was told he could continue on his way, he first initiated the dynamic brakes on the train as he started descending down the hill. Dynamic brakes reversed the electrical flow of the traction motors, converting the energy into heat, slowing the train down. He then initiates an application on the air brakes by reducing pressure in the brake lines. At 90 psi, the brakes are released, and normal applications bring the pressure to about 70 psi or lower, depending on how much was needed. The lower the PSI, the stronger the application. But as the engineer set the brakes, he felt the train wasn't really slowing down as it increased speed to 30 miles an hour. He put an even stronger application to counter it. Nothing happened. Then he set the brakes to emergency stop, dumping the air to 0 PSI. It still wasn't enough. He then realized he wasn't in control of his train anymore, as the slack of the train began to shove him down the hill at speeds of over 50 miles an hour. The speed limit into the yard was less than 15 miles an hour. He calls ahead to the dispatcher, informing him of his problem. The dispatcher acknowledged and halted all traffic, putting every signal in the area at a stop aspect, including one that the BNSF train ran 1 mile away from the yard. However, because the head-end job still had a switch lined onto the main, This meant the runaway was lined straight for the yard, not the main line. Richard Vitek had just stepped out of the yard office, about ready to get on his train, when he spotted an I-beam headlight in the dark rapidly approaching him. Him and his engineer noticed it was on a direct collision course with the two Sioux Line engines. Knowing he wouldn't make it out of the way, him and his engineer hit the deck both on the ground and in the cab of the CP leader. The BNSF crew did the same before the inevitable.
We had a runaway train come right through our assembly yard. We got everything out of control. Half our buildings got fired. We had many people hurt.
The BNSF train collided with the Sioux locomotives before ricocheting into the yard office, spreading 31 of its 89 cars all over the yard and all around the CP train, derailing 3 cars from the CP consist and 10 cars that were idle in the yard. Sioux Line 2408 was completely destroyed, with only parts of its cab surviving intact. GP 154102 had its rear radiator section sheared off from the flying debris, almost as if someone had taken a knife and cut it in half. CP 5725 and EMDX 6503 suffered moderate damage, again from the cars of the BNSF train being thrown around the yard like toys. The LMX B39s were buried amongst the wreckage, as was Richard Vitek, who, while he somehow survived the onslaught of cars derailing all around him and not only suffering minor injuries, was now trapped under a mountain of wreckage. It took several hours, lots of digging underground, and cutting metal from the wrecked cars before he was finally freed. 10 other employees in the yard, including the engineer of the CP train and the crew of the BNSF Runaway, were also injured, but thankfully, not a single person was killed. It was also a miracle that the BNSF train left a line of fully loaded tank cars full of gasoline that were in storage in the yard untouched. Otherwise, they could have exploded, setting fire to the area, killing people, or injuring more from burns and shrapnel. Rescuers were bewildered by the sight they saw before them. One firefighter, Captain Don Eddy of the St. Paul Fire Department, stated that it looked like a giant tornado had hit the area. When news broke out, people were already on edge, as just 2 weeks prior, on February 1st, another BNSF train had ran away down the Cajon Pass near San Bernardino, California, killing the conductor and brakeman and injuring the engineer. Only unlike St. Paul, tankers full of pesticide and other chemicals like butyl acrylic had burst into flames as the train jumped the track. Was it possible these two runaways were related? Was this a case of sabotage? BNSF officials certainly thought it was the latter, not only because of the Amtrak Sunset Limited sabotage 1 year prior on October 9, 1995 that killed a sleeper car attendant, but also because Dick Rusak, a spokesman for BNSF, said the railroad decided to call in the FBI after officials saw what they thought was, quote-unquote, some tampering with the train. He declined to elaborate, however. Other railroad sources, however, painted a different picture, saying a brake valve called an angle cock was found partially closed 24 cars behind the locomotives of the BNSF train at the wreckage site. Angle cocks are basically valves that allow the air from the brakes to flow from car to car. When the handle is parallel to the hose, it's open. When it's perpendicular, it's closed. Not to be confused with branch cocks on some older passenger car brake systems that are the opposite. Angle cocks should only be closed at the end of the train or when a set of cars are going to be cut from the consist during switching. We'll come back to the end of the train in a minute. If this angle cock had been moved during the train's last stop, there would have been no brakes for the rear 65 cars of the train, as train brakes are controlled by compressed air fed from the air compressors of the locomotives that run under each car and is connected by flexible hoses between the cars. At maximum pressure, being 90 psi, the brakes are off. Any reduction to the airline pressure will apply the brakes, and of course, no air in the line is considered an emergency application. If an angle cock were to be closed when the train was under pressure, this isolates the air past the closed section and will result in the cars not receiving any air changes to apply or release the brakes. Despite thorough investigations, no evidence of sabotage could be found, and the most plausible explanation was the valves being closed from being hit by the debris of the wreckage, since there was a huge gash in the valve. However, that didn't explain why the first 7 cars of the train and the locomotive's wheels were blued after cooling down from getting insanely hot from the brakes burning up as the train ran away down the steep grade. While many sources claim an air hose kinked, cutting the brake pressure, it was actually discovered there was an actual blockage in the 5th car of the train, where they found an ex-Rock Island air slide grain hopper that had ice buildup inside the airline. Adding on to that, the train was equipped with a one-way end-of-train device, or an EOT, also known as a FRED or flashing rear-end device, right around when railroads were first starting to do away with cabooses and move toward this new technology. Early EOTs were a little more than a brake line connection, a battery, and a flashing taillight. That's it. Either that or it's just a flag, which was common on locals, known as a dumb EOT. Just like with the 3rd Cajon Pass runaway, the EOT did play a role in the wreck. A one-way EOT just sends a brake pipe reading to the lead locomotive. A two-way EOT, which is the modern standard, does the same thing, among other data, but it also has the ability to put the train into emergency. Before EOTs, if you went into emergency, the rear of the train's slack would bunch up and run into you very hard, causing derailments, namely with lighter cars. With two-way EOTs, the train goes into emergency at an equal rate from the rear and the head end, which not only cancels out the chance of derailing and applies the brakes faster, but it can mitigate blockages in the brake lines. If the BNSF train sported a two-way EOT device, it would have been able to stop with a proper emergency application throughout the entire consist. After the accident, what little remained of SU 2408 as well as 4102 were scrapped, as was EMDX 6503, which, although not appearing to be as severely damaged from the post-wreck footage, was still listed as scrapped by 1996, so it's fair to assume the locomotive was scrapped after the wreck. CP 5725 was repaired and returned to service, and is still on the active roster of CPKC as of today. However, it retains its original reporting marks and livery from Canadian Pacific. The 2 B39-8s were also repaired. They stayed on BNSF till the lease from the BN days expired in 2001. Both were sold off to CEFX till being resold again to Relco, and then finally to the National Railway Equipment Company, or NREX. Shortly thereafter, both units were sold to other railroads, with 8572 going to the Nashville and Eastern Railroad until they were bought out by R.J. Corman in 2018. It is still in service as of today, sporting R.J. Corman colors. As for 8589, it went to the Seminole Gulf Railroad, but is stenciled and renumbered as Bay Colony 596. It is also still in service as of today. While those who were injured returned to work on the railroad, Richard Vitek didn't. He left his job on Canadian Pacific and has said in interviews he's not a fan of trains anymore. He also still has haunting memories of that fateful day, namely that headlight glow of the runaway coming toward him and the thunder of cars slamming into one another all around him. Much like Cajon Pass though, this wouldn't be the last runaway St. Paul would see. except it wouldn't be in Pig's Eye Yard, as on August 25th, 2021, Canadian Pacific Train 296-23 would run away and collide with Union Pacific M-SSDM-25, and the resulting collision derailed into another car from BNSF train HNTWBRC-25 at Control Point Division Street. No one was killed or injured, but that wreck, according to the NTSB, was caused by improper handling of the train's air brakes by the engineer of the Canadian Pacific train. Non-functional positive train control was also labeled as a contributing factor. Even today, there's still cases of runaway trains occurring, such as this one on January 12, 2024, when CPKC Train 251 stalled in Autonuma, Iowa, and started to roll back downhill into the path of BNSF 5946 West, who was occupying the diamond behind them when the CPKC started to slide backwards.
Alright, 251, are you guys still flying backwards over? We are, we're picking up speed here. I'm in emergency.
5946 West thankfully cleared the interlocking approximately 40 seconds before the tail of the CPKC train passed the north absolute signal, protecting the diamonds. It's as if, ever since the start of precision schedule railroading, the number of runaway train incidents appear to be on the rise for the first time ever since the 1990s, leaving many to wonder when and where will the next runaway train strike again? And when will we eventually see the last one?